Principles of Microeconomics, Chapter 5, Elasticity, Professor Wagner. Chapter 5, Outline. We're going to talk about elasticity with demand and pricing, polar cases of elasticity and constant elasticity, pricing, and other areas than price. This slide is using Netflix as an example of economic elasticity. And so the on-demand services, company, they had developed a pretty good-sized clientele, and in 2011, it had made some major packaging changes, including an increase in price. And so this will probably result in some elasticity dynamic of one sort or another. So this will be further discussed a little bit later on in the presentation. And these are definitions that you might want to know for the test. So elasticity is the economics concepts about the responsiveness of one variable changing to another variable. And price elasticity is about the percentage change in the quantity demanded or quantity supplied and the corresponding change in price by percent. And price elasticity of demand is the percentage change in the quantity of demanded goods, and the change of elasticity of supply is price elasticity of supply. There are three types of elasticity, and this is a very important slide. You might want to keep this one in mind for the test. Essentially, if you have a ratio, the change in quantity versus the change in price, and that turns out to be greater than 1, that ratio, then it's called elastic. If it's equal to 1, it's unitary. And then if it is less than 1, it's deemed inelastic. Examples to follow. These are the formulas on how to measure elasticity. This is the midpoint method. So the change in quantity is where you take the latest quantity result, subtract the first one, and then do the same thing here on the bottom, but you add those two, divide it by 2 times 100. That gives you a ratio. And the change in price is similar in terms of construct. In this example, they do sample calculations. First, you have to find the change in quantity. So this is the math. They take this data here to generate this number, the change in price. And then they use this data here, the 60 and 70 for the same set, and they find out what the percentage change in price, which would be this number here. The price elasticity of demand would be the change in quantity divided by the change in price. And when they divide that out, that's 0.45. If you recall from the previous slide, this is less than 1, so therefore inelastic. This is an example of calculating price elasticity of supply. And once again, you have a different graph. They're talking about thousands of rental units and the price per month of that unit. And so we need to calculate what category of elasticity it falls into. Once again, the percentage change in quantity. So you use the top number minus that number, add them together, divide it by 2, and you get this as your percentage result. Same calculation for the change in price. So the change in quantity divided by the change in price gives you the price elasticity of supply. And so its number is 3.53, and that is much greater than 1. So I'm going to draw that here. And so that's highly elastic. The polar cases of elasticity and constant elasticity. The first case is infinite elasticity or perfect elasticity. So really the price of the product doesn't change whatsoever, nor does the supply necessarily. So you'll see a horizontal So you'll see a horizontal demand curve or a horizontal supply curve in this particular instance. Another likely definition that may wind up on the test is to talk about zero elasticity or perfect inelasticity of either supply or demand. You'll notice the curve is totally vertical, has no slope at all, or an infinite slope, if you will, mathematically. This is a case of constant unitary elasticity, and so that can happen either in a supply or demand curve, and that's when the price change of 1% results in the quantity change of 1%, so that's illustrated here. This percentage divided by that percentage is 1. This percentage by that percentage divided is 1. This one divided by that one is 1. And a demand curve will always be curved. So this is a demand curve because it's negative slope, and you notice the curvature. The next slide will show the constant unitary elasticity for supply, and you'll notice the same thing. This divided by that is 1, and so on and so forth. And it is a straight line, and it starts from the origin. Businesses use elasticity in pricing to try and figure out ways to produce at a lower cost, thus increasing their margins. However, if there are components or key inputs like materials or labor or other factors which the firm has no control over, that could rise or fall. And so the question being asked would be, can they pass on the cost savings to customers or pass on the cost in general? And so that'll be answered by a study. So these are examples of the dynamic cost saving with an inelastic demand. And so you notice the demand curve is very steep. And so if you shift the supply curve from left to right, so that will shift to the right, what happens is this is your, at this much higher price, E of 0, that's quantity 0, which is very close to the Q1 demand, but even at a lower price, so much lower price. This is the equilibrium. So yeah, it doesn't really matter so much what you charge, the demand is pretty much the same. So the difference between this delta between these two. On the supply side of things, if you have a relatively flat demand curve and you have this as your starting equilibrium point and the supply curve shifts to the right in this case, what will happen is the price will not be too mobile. So from a pricing point, it's mobile regardless of quantity. So there's a big shift in quantity being demanded. However, the price changes very little in this. A problem that many business owners face is elasticity and tax incidence. And so if demand is more inelastic than supply, consumers will bear most of the tax burden. If the supply is more inelastic than demand, then sellers bear most of the tax burden. I'll go ahead and put a little star here, know that for the test. A graphical illustration of what we've been talking about. And so in this instance, we have a change in excise tax is, so excise tax is included as part of the cost. And so when the demand is more elastic than supply, the PC minus E is lower than the tax incident on producers. So producers are getting hit with more tax here. And in this particular example, B, the consumer is getting hit with more tax here. And the producer's tax is here. So we'll just say C for consumer, P for producer, P for producer. C for consumer. Sorry for the writing, but writing with a mouse is so much fun. There are both long run and short run impacts of elasticities. And so elasticities are often lower in the short run than in the long run. And that has something to do with the stickiness of nature. Basically, it takes a bit of time for markets to react to a change in supply or demand. And so we could say there's a stickiness of price or there's a stickiness of quantity being produced. Things don't happen immediately, so it's not really evident in the short run what's going on. In the longer run, it becomes evident because everything's had a chance to move, and so you get a much clearer picture. And in most markets for goods and services, short-run prices bounce up and down more than quantities. In the long run, quantities will move more than the prices. Something you might want to consider to remember. Responsiveness of demand to price of crude oil. A shows inelastic demand for oil in the short run. So in the short run, the quantity doesn't move a whole lot with respect to price. Pricing moves, quite a bit with, where the demand hasn't really budged a whole lot. On the other side of the picture, the pricing. So over the long run, the pricing doesn't change so much. However, there is a greater change in demand over here. A small little formula on how to measure income elasticity of demand. Change in quantity demanded, change in income. So most of the time, income elasticity of demand is positive. And so a rise in income will cause an increase in the quantity demanded. That's pretty intuitive. Another measure we look at is a cross-price elasticity of demand. So they're looking at the change of price on one good could shift the quantity demanded for yet another good. Cross-price elasticity of demand, change in quantity of good A that is demanded as a result of change in price good B. This is the formula of how you measure that. And so you want to consider what are examples of complement and substitute goods where price change of one good could cause a change in demand of the other. I'll give you something super simplistic. So let's say hot dogs are fairly cheap, therefore the demand for hot dog buns would probably be plentiful. Well, let's say the number of hot dogs produced, is diminishes for some reason, or the price goes up, then the demand for buns will follow. So that's one good affecting change in the other good. The formula for wage elasticity of labor supply, this one's for labor demand, and what they're measuring is the change in quantity of labor demanded with respect to the change in wage, and the same with the supply, the change in labor supplied with the rate of change in wage. Similar formulas also apply to the financial capital markets. You can kind of take a look at the formulas and you can see what's going on. Very similar across the board. The Netflix example, there was a 60% price change in 2011. So before the price increase, they had 25 million subscribers, where a million drop off. And then if you fast forward a couple of years later, there were 36 million streaming customers. However, that hit their projections a little bit low. They only grew about 1.6 million a quarter as opposed to the 2 million they probably projected. So they wanted to know, why was the estimate of customers leaving so far off, and how did Netflix management screw up? And so misjudgment of elasticity of demand would be one of the reasons cited, because there were close substitutes or competitors like Amazon Prime and Hulu. And the misjudgment of customer preferences and taste. There were still at this time people who still like to watch DVDs as opposed to streaming video. That probably had something to do with network bandwidth at that point in time. End of chapter 5.